Garmagat, and thanks to the officials for this meeting and update on the review and of the planning legislation. It's long overdue, I think, and so it's very, very welcome, and we want to support you in this work. One of the things that's being cited as a major threat to the state's ability and the government's ability to address the housing crisis is actually planning. It repeatedly comes up as being an impediment based on, both feedback from the construction industry and other stakeholders. So I think this review needs to focus on how the planning process can be improved to de-risk construction, or at least reduce the risk involved in it, and secondarily to try and reduce the cost, because obviously the crisis is characterised by both the lack of availability and cost and lack of affordability. So I just wonder, can you advise us if that will be captured in the review and if that is a specific objective? And then I also would like to understand how you're engaging with our local authority members around the country on this review. The councillors and the elected local representatives have the challenge of making the county and city development plans, but I think they can provide an invaluable input into your work, and I just want to know how the department is engaging directly with them and engaging them in this process and this review. Gormagat.
Thank you, Senator Fitzpatrick. Ms. Graham.
Thanks very much, Senator. I think the two issues the issues that you raise around how the planning system supports both housing and infrastructure, I think probably in the context of this review probably break down to two issues for me. One is the whole issue of planning and planning for an area and placemaking is part of a community engagement, and the pieces that I mentioned at the beginning is the public acceptability of many of the policies. And so one of the aspects, if you like, you could talk about a de-risking, but really I think in terms of bringing planning forward is to ensure that we maximise the engagement of the public in the plan making process so that there is clarity at the very earliest stages of what the development objectives are for that area. And I think that's one area that would bring a big improvement, I think, to the planning area. The other is the question of certainty, and it is probably, as we come to talk about more the consent process, I think one of the issues that we are dealing with are issues such as timelines. So obviously we've introduced very specific timelines in terms of large-scale residential development, so that's an area of exploration. And then the other question you had, so the local authority elected members are on the Planning Advisory Forum, so that's how we have been engaging. The Planning Advisory Forum has had a number of meetings, so it's the ALIG is there, but we're happy to engage any further that we do, but that's the engagement process that we have at the moment.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. And you might want to include LAMA as well as the AILG. Just earlier this week at our meetings, we had stakeholders in talking about the costs of construction. And specifically, they raised the issue of the viability of apartment building. And it's a real thorny issue, but they were particularly asking for at the early stage of the process that the viability, at the early stage of a planning process, that the viability of any project would be established. Do you see scope to include that? Will it be included in your review, and is there scope to do that, do you think?
I think there's probably a mix of areas in which viability will be drawn in, and I don't know if Paul wants to talk a bit more, but in terms of specific proposals around urban development zones, for example, which will be a key area where apartments will do, I might ask Paul to talk a little bit, that will factor that piece in. And then obviously we would have a number of policy measures that are seen to improve viability. But I think in approaching the development plan process, it is important that the issue of viability is borne in mind in terms of as people are looking at that area. Paul, you might come in a little bit on the urban development zones.
Yeah, sure. I think there's a parallel piece of work happening on foot of the heads of a bill that we had published before Christmas. And we're now doing economic evaluation of that with consultants to look at the impact it might have. So it's the land value sharing in urban development zones proposal, which is really a kind of a modern incarnation of the Kenny report and how that might be applied to the system as it exists. So that piece of work is happening in parallel with the review, and it's very much overlapping. And I expect, you know, by the time we get to the end of that stage, it will be incorporated into the final bill. So the idea there is that there would be potential for a greater level of state intervention, particularly in the land assembly process and you know, an investment in areas that are identified for development in a kind of a comprehensive planned way. The start point was a kind of an extension of the Part 5 model. But you know, to extend further the extent of a land holding that the state could acquire at existing use value, but we are, I suppose, as an evolution of that in response to the you know, the feedback and the analysis that the economic consultants are tasked to look at, open to sort of further you know, evolution or change in that regard. And that's something that we have to work through on a policy basis. But just to say, for example, the issue of development levies is often raised in relation to viability, and that's very much part of the Planning and Development Act. And you know, development levies generally fund infrastructure and facilities that benefit existing communities and are set by existing councils. So, you know, how can we better address development levies through a more comprehensive system that also looks at land and looks at future development? So that's part of the consideration of the land value sharing, and it has a resonance or knock on then into the Act, because, you know, the question is, do we you know, do we have a sort of two-tier scenario whereby you know, you have levies in some areas and then a more comprehensive approach in others, or do we try and sort of merge the two in a better way across, you know, whole local authority areas for all development? So there's a lot of sort of complex work happening in parallel, you know, but that's a really core issue for development and to address, you know, the sorts of but the reality is the sort of development we need to see more of in our urban areas in particular. You know, the question of viability is key, and I think, you know, we are certainly open to greater consideration of it, but I don't think we would think that it should be overriding, because it starts then to become a question of profitability rather than viability.
Yeah. That's great, Paul. Thanks very much. And there's no doubt that it's really important, the work that you're doing on the land value sharing, and that's very welcome. The impression I got from them was separate to that strategic type, a change of direction, that strategic action around addressing the land value and its contribution to the cost. Separately, the impression I got was that separately they were looking for actual changes to the planning process on individual planning applications. But I'll clarify that and come back to you.
Okay, thanks.
But, thank you for that.
Thanks, Senator Fitzpatrick.